Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was the kind of place you only stopped at when you had no other choice. A small, rundown roadside cafe off the main highway, nestled between the thick woods and rolling hills. The kind of cafe that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. The neon sign outside flickered sporadically, but it was enough to catch the attention of weary travelers looking for a place to rest. Jason had been driving for hours. He was on a road trip, headed south for business, and had just crossed into a more isolated stretch of highway. The sun was setting, and he had already passed the last few towns with no sign of any decent place to eat or stop for the night. The cafe was a godsend, or so he thought at the time. He pulled off the highway and into the gravel parking lot, the tires crunching as he parked under one of the dimly lit lamps. The place was quiet, too quiet. A few cars were scattered about, but there was no sign of activity inside. Jason hesitated for a moment before getting out of the car, thinking about just driving on, but his stomach growled. He needed something to eat, and it seemed like the only option. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and old grease, a blend that made Jason's stomach turn slightly. The interior was small, with faded red vinyl booths lining the walls and a counter at the far end. The light overhead buzzed, adding to the dull, oppressive atmosphere. The place felt frozen in time, stuck in some limbo between past and present. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman, her back hunched as she wiped a glass with a rag. Her face was pale, almost as if the years had taken their toll, leaving her skin thin and translucent. She looked up when Jason entered, her expression unreadable. "Evening," she said in a voice that cracked like old wood. "What can I get you?" Jason hesitated, but then ordered a coffee and whatever they had for dinner. The woman gave him a slow nod and turned to prepare his meal. The cafe was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of cutlery on plates. He sat down in one of the booths, the leather squeaking under his weight. The air felt colder than it should have been, especially for a warm evening in the summer. He shivered slightly and pulled his jacket tighter around him. As he waited for his food, he glanced around the room, trying to find something to distract himself. The walls were covered in old photos, black and white images of what looked like previous generations of people who had worked at the cafe. There was a photograph of a man in a military uniform, another of a young couple smiling in front of the same cafe, and yet another of a woman holding a child. All of them had that eerie stillness that old photos tended to carry. Jason couldn't help but stare at the photograph of the military man. Something about his face seemed oddly familiar, though he couldn't place where he had seen him before. It was as if the man was staring right back at him, his eyes locked with Jason's. The elderly woman returned with his food, a greasy plate of fried chicken and mashed potatoes with a side of wilted greens. She set it down in front of him with a thin smile. "Enjoy," she said, her eyes lingering on him just a little too long. Jason forced a smile and nodded, but the uneasy feeling was starting to grow in his chest. There was something off about the place, the silence, the strange photos, and now the woman's unsettling gaze. He took a bite of his food, trying to push the thoughts from his mind. But before he could finish his meal, he heard it, a faint sound, a whisper, almost too soft to hear. Jason froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The whispering seemed to come from the far corner of the cafe, where a small door was partially open. It led to what Jason assumed was a storage room. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the hum of an old fan, but then it came again, clearer this time. "Help me." Jason looked around. The elderly woman was behind the counter, her back turned to him, still wiping glasses, oblivious. He could feel his heart start to race, and against his better judgment, he stood up and walked toward the sound. The closer he got to the storage room, the more the whispering intensified. It was as though someone or something was right there, just beyond the door. His hand reached out toward the door handle, but he stopped himself. It wasn't his business. He wasn't the type to snoop. Yet something inside him urged him to open the door, to see what lay behind it. With a deep breath, he slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was pitch black, save for a small window high up on the far wall, where the last of the evening light seeped through. The whispering stopped as soon as the door creaked open, leaving only the sound of Jason's own breath. The room was full of old furniture, boxes stacked haphazardly, shelves filled with dusty bottles, and chairs covered in faded cloths. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for one thing, a mirror. It hung on the far wall, old and tarnished, with a frame that looked like it belonged in a much older house. Jason couldn't help but walk closer to it, drawn to its dark surface. His reflection appeared faintly at first, but the longer he stared, the clearer it became. And then, he saw it. In the reflection, standing behind him, was the man from the photograph, the military man. His face was just as he had seen it in the picture, and he was staring directly at Jason with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Jason whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the furniture and boxes. His heart was pounding in his chest as he turned back to the mirror. The reflection was now empty as well. He backed away from the mirror, his mind racing. What the hell was happening? The whispering. The photograph. The man in the mirror. It couldn't be a coincidence. Suddenly, he heard the creak of footsteps behind him. He spun around, his pulse quickening, but there was no one there. The room felt colder now, a chill seeping into his bones. "Looking for something?" a voice said, and Jason spun toward the doorway. The elderly woman was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable, but her eyes glinting in a way that made Jason's blood run cold. Jason started, his voice shaking. "I heard something." She gave him a knowing look. "You shouldn't go back there," she said softly. "Not everyone who comes here leaves." Jason didn't wait to hear any more. He rushed past her, out of the storage room, and back into the main part of the cafe. The door slammed shut behind him as he practically ran for the exit. As he reached for the door handle, he looked back once more at the elderly woman. She was standing by the counter, watching him with those same intense, unblinking eyes. Her lips curled into a small, sad smile, as if she had known exactly what was going to happen. Jason didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open and ran outside, his heart racing, his mind reeling. He didn't stop until he was back in his car, engine roaring to life. He didn't even look back as he drove off, the gravel of the parking lot scattering beneath his tires. To this day, Jason has never spoken about what happened at that roadside cafe. He doesn't stop at any other cafes on his long drives anymore, and he certainly never went back to that one. He knows one thing for sure. The man in the photograph wasn't just a man from the past. He was something else, something that never left. And that cafe, it wasn't just a place to eat. It was a trap. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It had been a long day on the road, and Danny was exhausted. He had driven more than 12 hours, making his way through winding roads and remote stretches of highway in the middle of nowhere. It was late October, and a storm had been threatening all day. The wind had picked up in the past hour, making the trees sway violently, and the sky had darkened, even though it was only early evening. His phone had no signal, and there weren't any nearby towns or motels. He was beginning to wonder if he had taken a wrong turn somewhere when he saw a flicker of light in the distance. A small sign on the side of the road read, "Gracie's Roadside Cafe, Food and Fuel." It was the kind of place he would usually pass by, but the storm was coming in fast, and he needed to eat and get out of the weather. The warm light of the cafe seemed like a welcome sight. Danny pulled into the gravel parking lot, which was nearly empty except for a couple of old trucks. The building itself looked worn down, the paint chipped and faded, but it had a nostalgic charm to it, like something out of an old movie. He parked near the front door and walked inside, the bell above the door jingling as he stepped through. The inside of the cafe was dimly lit with fluorescent lights buzzing in the corner. The walls were decorated with vintage memorabilia, old advertisements, and faded photos of people from years past. A counter ran along one side of the room, and there were a few booths scattered around. It looked like a place that hadn't changed in decades. The only other person inside was an elderly woman behind the counter. She looked up when Danny entered and gave him a smile that was both warm and weary. "Evening, hon. What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice raspy from years of use. Danny hesitated for a moment. "Just a cup of coffee and something hot to eat. Anything you have." She nodded and turned to a small stove behind her. The clattering of pots and pans filled the room, and Danny took a seat at the counter. The place was quiet, save for the low hum of the overhead lights and the occasional rumble of thunder from the storm outside. He tried to shake off the fatigue, but it clung to him, and he felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. He glanced around at the photographs on the wall, black and white images of people he didn't recognize. In one, a man stood with a woman beside an old truck, smiling at the camera. In another, a family of 4 posed in front of what appeared to be the same cafe. There was something strange about them, though. All the people in the photos looked blank. Their smiles seemed forced, their eyes cold, as if they weren't really there at all. The woman returned to the counter, placing a steaming mug of coffee in front of him. "Here you go. I'll be right with your meal," she said softly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment too long. Danny nodded and picked up the coffee, taking a cautious sip. It was strong, bitter, exactly what he needed to wake himself up. He glanced outside, watching as the rain began to pour down in sheets. The storm was getting worse, and he didn't feel like leaving anytime soon. The woman returned with a plate of food, scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. It wasn't much, but it looked homemade, comforting in a way. He thanked her as she set it down in front of him, then turned back to the kitchen to clean some dishes. Danny ate in silence, the only sound being the occasional clink of silverware against the plate. He wasn't sure why, but he felt unnerved in the cafe. It wasn't just the storm or the loneliness. It was the oppressive quiet that seemed to hang in the air, the strange feeling that he wasn't quite alone. He kept glancing around, his eyes drifting back to the photos on the wall. Each time he felt like the people in them were watching him, their eyes following his movements. The elderly woman who had introduced herself as Gracie eventually came back to refill his coffee. Her presence was calm, almost ghostly. Danny tried to make small talk. "So, how long have you been running this place?" he asked, breaking the silence. Gracie smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, for many years now. Long enough to see a lot of folks come and go. The road has a way of bringing people through here, but most of them don't stay long. They don't know what it is about this place that keeps them passing through, but they never stay. Not for long." Danny raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Gracie didn't respond right away. She just seemed to be lost in thought, staring down at the counter as though there was something she was trying to remember. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost like she was speaking to herself. "It's funny," she muttered. "Some of the people who come through here, they're never the same when they leave. Like something happens to them while they're here. They get a kind of look in their eyes, like they've seen something. Or maybe they've been seen." Danny shivered involuntarily. It was just the weather, he told himself, just the wind rattling the windows. But the unease that had been building in his chest all evening was starting to settle deeper in his bones. Gracie walked back to the kitchen, leaving Danny to finish his meal. He felt suddenly exhausted, drained by the atmosphere in the cafe. He glanced around again, and his eyes were drawn to one particular photo on the wall. An old black and white portrait of a man standing next to the same truck from earlier. This man had a dark, intense gaze, and something about his expression made Danny feel like he was staring directly into his soul. It was then that he realized the man in the photo was the same person he had seen driving into the parking lot when he first arrived. The truck outside, the one parked next to his car, had that same worn-out look. Danny's heart began to race. He hadn't seen anyone else come in when he arrived, but the man in the photo was unmistakable. How could he not have noticed him? Suddenly, there was a knock on the window, so sharp and sudden it made Danny jump. His pulse quickened, and he turned toward the window, his stomach sinking. The rain had stopped for a moment, and he could see the silhouette of a figure standing outside, looking in through the glass. It was the man from the photograph. Danny's throat tightened. He stood up quickly, knocking over his cup of coffee in the process, but before he could reach the door, the bell rang above the entrance again. When he turned around, there was the elderly woman standing there with a distant look in her eyes. "I'd be careful if I were you," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "Some people who come in here don't get to leave the way they think they will." Danny, they've got unfinished business, and sometimes they stay. Danny's stomach twisted. His eyes flickered back to the man outside, but the figure was gone. The rain had returned in full force, and the window was now blurred with water, making it impossible to see anything. Danny started, his voice shaking. I think I'll be going now. Gracie smiled again, that same sad, knowing smile. You should, she said, but you might not be the one to decide that. Without waiting for another word, Danny grabbed his jacket and bolted out of the cafe. He didn't look back, didn't stop to check if the man from the photo was still outside. He just ran to his car and drove away, his heart pounding in his chest, the rain beating down on his windshield. To this day, Danny hasn't been able to forget the cafe or the strange feeling that lingered long after he had driven away. He never told anyone about what happened that night, but sometimes, when he's driving late at night, he wonders if he'll ever pass that same stretch of road again, and if he'll see that cafe in the distance waiting for him to come back. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I had been driving for hours through the empty stretches of road, the landscape blurring into one indistinguishable stretch of asphalt. It was late, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind rattling the car. The weather had turned, and I wasn't sure if I was going to make it to my destination before nightfall. I hadn't seen a town for miles, and I was running low on gas. The thought of driving for hours more in the dark without a place to stop was beginning to weigh on me. And then, like an oasis in the middle of nowhere, I saw it. A small, dimly lit sign on the side of the road that read, Gracie's Roadside Cafe. It looked like something straight out of the 1950s, with a neon sign flickering and buzzing above the door. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, noticing only a few cars parked near the entrance, all weathered and old. It felt like the kind of place where time had slowed down, where everything stood still. I was exhausted and I needed a break. Some food, some rest, maybe even a cup of coffee to keep me going. I parked my car and got out, the chill of the night air immediately hitting me. The small bell above the door jingled as I walked in. The cafe was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of grease and old coffee. The walls were decorated with vintage ads, yellowed photographs of people who looked like they hadn't changed in years, and faded floral wallpaper. There was an old jukebox in the corner and a couple of booths along the side of the room. A long counter stretched along one wall with a few stools and a glass display case with what looked like homemade pies. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face lined with years of wear and tear. She smiled at me when I walked in, her eyes bright despite the deep lines around them. "Evening, Han. What can I get you?" she asked, her voice raspy but warm. I looked at the menu on the wall, but honestly, I wasn't paying much attention. The only thing I wanted was food and a place to rest. I ordered a cup of coffee and whatever she had for dinner. The woman nodded and turned toward the kitchen, her movements slow but deliberate. I took a seat at the counter, watching her prepare my meal. The cafe was quiet, unnervingly so. The hum of the lights above was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional clink of dishes in the back. I glanced around, trying to find something to occupy my mind, but the photographs on the walls caught my attention. Old black and white pictures of people posing in front of what appeared to be the cafe. In every one of them, the people wore tight smiles, their eyes lifeless, as if they were trapped in the frames, unable to break free. There was one photo that stood out, a man in a military uniform standing next to a woman in an old-fashioned dress smiling at the camera. Their eyes, though, weren't like the others. They seemed dark, cold, even knowing. I felt a strange chill creep over me, but I pushed it away. It was just the atmosphere, the quiet of the place, the strange nostalgia that seemed to hang in the air. The woman returned with my food, a plate of fried chicken and mashed potatoes with gravy. It smelled delicious, but I was having a hard time shaking the unsettling feeling that had settled in my chest. The woman set the plate down in front of me, then stood there for a moment, watching me eat with that same knowing smile. "Not many people stop here," she said, her voice soft. "It's a quiet place, a lonely place sometimes." I looked up at her, not sure how to respond. "Yeah, it's pretty far off the main road." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes glinting strangely. A lot of people drive past and don't even notice it. Some do stop, but most leave quickly. Don't like to stay too long. I raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. Why's that? The woman leaned closer, her voice lowering to a near whisper. Well, Han, some folks just don't leave the way they come in. Her words hung in the air, and I suddenly felt a little uneasy. I didn't want to entertain whatever strange notion she was hinting at, so I just nodded and forced a smile. I focused on my food, trying to ignore the strange atmosphere in the cafe. But as I ate, the silence became heavier, almost oppressive. The air felt thick, like I wasn't just alone in the cafe. It was as if the space around me was full of something I couldn't see, an energy that wasn't quite right. The photographs on the walls, the woman's words, and the eerie stillness made me feel like I was intruding on something I didn't understand. I finished my meal quickly, wanting to leave. But when I looked at the clock on the wall, I realized it was much later than I thought. It had to be past midnight, and then the storm outside was getting worse. I felt my nerves fray as I glanced out the window at the sheets of rain beating against the glass. I didn't want to drive through that storm, not in the middle of nowhere. "Do you have a place to stay?" The woman asked suddenly, as if reading my thoughts. I looked up at her, a little surprised. "I hadn't planned on staying. I'm just passing through." She nodded slowly, her face thoughtful. "You're welcome to stay here, if you want. I've got a room out back, just a place to rest for the night." I hesitated. Something about the offer seemed strange. I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in a room behind the cafe, not after the strange feeling I had. But the storm outside made the decision for me. "I'll take the room," I said, deciding that a few hours of sleep were better than driving through a storm in the middle of nowhere. The woman led me to a small door at the back of the cafe, just behind the kitchen. It creaked as she opened it, revealing a narrow hallway that led to a single room. It wasn't much, just a bed, a small dresser, and a lamp on the nightstand. But it was warm and quiet, and I was exhausted. The woman showed me to the bed and made sure I had everything I needed. She gave me a key to lock the door, then turned to leave. "Sleep tight," she said softly, "and don't worry, you'll be safe here." The door clicked shut behind her, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling. The sound of the rain outside was deafening, and the wind howled against the window. But there was something about the quiet of the room that made me restless. I felt like I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. The air was thick, as if something was waiting, watching. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt a chill on the back of my neck. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then I heard it. A faint sound, barely a whisper, came from the corner of the room. It was a low murmur, almost like a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart started pounding in my chest as I sat up in bed, trying to see through the darkness. The whispering grew louder, clearer, as though someone was standing just beyond the edge of the room, speaking in a language I didn't understand. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out to demand an explanation, but I couldn't. My body felt frozen, as though I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. I finally found the courage to get out of bed and turn on the light. As soon as I did, the whispering stopped, and the room was eerily silent once again. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But when I looked out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure of a man, standing outside in the rain, staring up at me through the glass. His eyes were dark and hollow, his face twisted in a grimace. I froze, unable to look away. The man outside took a step toward the window, his face still pressed against the glass. And then just as quickly, he vanished. I bolted out of the room and ran back to the main part of the cafe. The woman was sitting at the counter as though nothing had happened. She didn't even look up as I rushed in. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice calm, like she already knew the answer. I didn't answer. I just ran out the door and into my car, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back as I sped off, out of the rain pouring down harder than ever. I've never stopped at a roadside cafe again. And I never will. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know one thing for sure. The man outside that window wasn't alive, and the cafe wasn't as empty as it seemed. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It had been a long drive, and I was tired. The road stretched out endlessly ahead of me, an unremarkable highway with only the occasional signpost breaking the monotony. I was on my way to visit family, far from home, and I'd been driving for hours. The storm had hit in the late afternoon, and now, in the evening, it was in full force, with heavy rain and wind making the road even more treacherous. My phone had lost signal an hour ago, and I hadn't seen a gas station or a motel in what felt like forever. That's when I saw the sign, Gracie's Roadside Cafe. It was small and weathered, the paint peeling off the wooden posts, but it stood out against the dark backdrop of the storm. There was something about it that called to me, maybe the desperation for food or the need to take shelter from the storm. Whatever it was, I made the turn and pulled into the gravel parking lot. There were a few cars parked there already, all of them older models with rusted bodies. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the cafe. The building was small, and the windows were fogged up with condensation, making it hard to see inside. The neon sign flickered above the door, struggling to stay lit. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Fried food, grease, and something else. Something faintly musty, like the air hadn't been changed in years. The cafe was dimly lit, with a few fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting an eerie glow over everything. The walls were lined with old photographs, some black and white, some sepia-toned, of families and people I didn't recognize. There were vintage advertisements and faded knickknacks scattered around the room. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman, her back hunched slightly as she wiped down the surface. Her face was lined with age, her skin a deep shade of weathered leather. She looked up as I entered and gave me a welcoming smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, good evening, Han," she said in a raspy voice. "What can I get for you?" I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I chalked it up to the storm and my exhaustion. "Just a cup of coffee and something to eat, please," I said, glancing around at the menu on the wall. "Coffee, sure," she replied, "and I'll fix you up a hot meal. It's not much, but it'll do the trick." I took a seat at one of the stools at the counter, my eyes still drifting over the photographs on the walls. The people in the pictures all had the same kind of expression, smiling, yes, but somehow vacant, like they were frozen in time, unable to break free. It unsettled me, but I tried to ignore it. The woman behind the counter placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of me, and I took a sip. It was strong, almost bitter, but I welcomed the warmth. I didn't notice at first, but when I looked closer, there was something strange about the cafe. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was hanging just out of sight. "You're far from home," the woman said, breaking my concentration. I looked up, startled. She had returned to wiping down the counter, but her eyes were fixed on me. "Where are you headed?" "Just visiting family," I replied, trying to sound casual. "A few hours from here." She nodded slowly, as though she already knew. "This road's been around a long time. Folks come through here, but they don't stay. Not for long, anyway." I furrowed my brow. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed a plate of food in front of me, some kind of stew with bread on the side. It smelled delicious, though there was a strange, almost metallic undertone to the scent. "I mean," she continued, "sometimes people stop in, but they never seem to leave the way they came in. They change, you know?" I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had been exhausted from the drive, but now a sense of unease washed over me, like the atmosphere in the cafe had suddenly shifted. Before I could respond, the door to the cafe opened, and a man stepped inside, shaking the rain off his coat. He was tall, with a rugged face that looked like it had been worn down by years of hard living. His eyes were dark, and when he caught my gaze, I noticed the same cold emptiness in them that I had seen in the photographs on the walls. The woman behind the counter looked at him, then back at me. She didn't say anything, but I could tell something was off. The man walked past me without a word and took a seat in the corner booth. He didn't order anything, just sat there, staring at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The man's eyes never left me, even as I ate. Every now and then I would glance up, and I would catch his gaze again. It was as if he were studying me, measuring me. I forced myself to focus on my meal, but the unease didn't go away. Eventually, I finished eating, and the woman came over to clear my plate. "You done, Han?" she asked. I nodded, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. I stood up to leave, but the man in the corner booth suddenly spoke. "You shouldn't be driving in the storm," he said, his voice gravelly. I froze. "What?" "You shouldn't be out there in the rain," he repeated, his eyes still locked on mine. "You don't know what's out there." I took a step back, my mind racing. "I'm fine," I said quickly, but the words felt hollow. I didn't know why, but I felt like something was wrong, like I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. The woman behind the counter smiled again, but this time it was a cold smile, not the friendly one from earlier. "You're right, Han," she said. "It's best to stay here for a while, just in case. The storm's only going to get worse." I shook my head, suddenly desperate to leave. "I appreciate it, but I need to get going." The man in the booth stood up then slowly. He was tall, and as he approached the counter, he didn't take his eyes off me. The woman didn't seem to notice, but I could feel his presence closing in, like something dark was pressing down on me. "Sometimes, people just need a little help," the man said softly, his voice low and threatening. "And they don't even know it." I stepped backward, my heart racing. "I'm leaving now," I said, more forcefully this time. I turned toward the door, but as I did, I noticed something strange in the reflection of the window. The people in the photographs on the wall, the ones that had seemed so lifeless earlier, they were now standing, their faces contorted in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. The door swung open, and I bolted outside, slamming it behind me. The rain hit my face like ice, but I didn't care. I ran to my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot as quickly as I could. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the cafe still behind me, its neon sign flickering in the storm, but there was nothing. The road was empty, and the cafe was gone. I never found that road again. No matter how many times I searched for it, I could never remember exactly where it was. The cafe, the woman, the man, everything about that night felt like it was fading away. But sometimes when I'm alone and the weather's stormy, I swear I can still hear the distant sound of that bell ringing, like someone is waiting for me to return. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was a cold autumn evening, and I had been driving for hours on an isolated highway. The rain had started earlier, and it didn't show any signs of letting up. The only sound in the car was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rumble of thunder from the distant storm. I was on my way to visit a friend in a small town a few hours away, but the weather had made it impossible to keep track of time. I had passed what felt like 100 empty miles, with no sign of civilization. As I glanced at my gas gauge, I realized I was running low. Up ahead, through the misty rain, I saw a small flickering neon sign in the distance. "Gracie's Roadside Cafe," it read, with a faded, old-fashioned font. My heart lifted a little. A place to stop, maybe grab a coffee, and hopefully stretch my legs. The sign looked so out of place, almost too nostalgic for the bleak surroundings, but I didn't hesitate to make the turn into the gravel parking lot. The cafe sat alone by the side of the road, nestled between two thick patches of trees. The parking lot was almost empty, with only one other car parked near the door, its headlights dim. The building itself seemed frozen in time. It was small, with a peeling white paint job and a tin roof that had seen better days. The dim glow of the neon lights from the sign reflected off the wet ground, giving the place a surreal, otherworldly feel. I stepped out of the car, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the rain. As I made my way up to the door, a shiver crawled up my spine, but I dismissed it. I was just tired from the drive. The door creaked open with a faint bell ringing above it, signaling my arrival. Inside, the warmth of the cafe hit me immediately. The place smelled of coffee, stale cigarette smoke, and something faintly sweet. Pies, maybe? It wasn't unpleasant, but there was something about the air that felt heavy, as if the room had been waiting for me. The cafe was dimly lit, with old-fashioned wallpaper peeling at the edges. The floor was worn with age, and there were several small booths along the walls, each separated by cheap, aging curtains. The counter was long, with a glass display case showcasing what appeared to be homemade pies and pastries. Behind the counter stood a woman who looked to be in her late 60s, maybe early 70s. Her skin was pale and wrinkled, and her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. She wore a faded apron over a plain dress, and when she looked up from the counter, her pale blue eyes seemed to pierce right through me. "Well, hello there, dear," she said in a soft, gravelly voice. "What can I get for you?" I smiled nervously, taken aback by her intensity. Just a coffee, please," I replied, trying to sound casual. She nodded, turning to pour a cup from a large pot that sat on a burner. "It's real quiet tonight," she remarked, her back still turned to me as she set the coffee cup in front of me. "Not many folks stop by here this time of night." "Yeah," I said, trying to break the awkwardness. "I've been driving for hours, and it's starting to get pretty bad out there." She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "Oh, it's always like this around here," she said, her voice carrying an odd finality to it. "People stop for a bit, but they never stay long." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of how to respond to that. The woman seemed to study me for a long moment, and I shifted uncomfortably on the bar stool. She smiled, a thin, almost sad smile, before turning back to the coffee pot. The silence in the room was deafening. The rain hit the windows, a constant, rhythmic tapping. The faint hum of a ceiling fan above me did little to break the stillness. The walls were adorned with old photographs, black and white portraits of families from decades ago. All of them wore strained smiles, their eyes distant, like they weren't quite there. "Do you come here often?" I asked, attempting to fill the silence. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed a pie in front of me. An apple pie, the crust golden and perfectly flaky, steam still rising from the filling. I hadn't asked for pie, but there it was, a warm plate set before me. "You might want to try a slice," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "It's fresh, made just for you." I blinked, surprised. "I didn't order." "No need to order," she interrupted, her smile widening. "It's been waiting for someone like you." My stomach churned. Something about her words sent a cold wave of unease over me. I glanced at the pie, then back up at her, unsure how to proceed. There was an eerie sense of familiarity about her actions, as if I were part of some script she had performed 100 times before. "I'm just passing through," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I really don't think I should stay too long. I need to keep going." Her smile faltered for a brief second, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, dear," she said, her tone almost soothing now. "But you know, it's not always easy to leave once you've stopped." I didn't respond, suddenly feeling like I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. My fingers hovered over the pie, but I didn't have the appetite for it anymore. I turned my attention back to my coffee, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air felt heavier now, thicker. There was a presence in the room, an energy that seemed to be building, pressing in on me from all sides. I glanced around, noticing the other car outside was now gone. In fact, the entire parking lot was empty. The place felt eerily deserted, despite the warm lights inside. The woman stood quietly behind the counter, her eyes fixed on me once again. "It's funny," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You can drive and drive, but you always end up coming back." I felt my heart rate quicken. "Coming back?" I repeated, my voice shaky. She smiled again, but it was no longer a warm expression. It was something else, something much colder. "Everyone who stops here comes back," she murmured. "No one leaves for good." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The pie on the plate seemed to loom larger in front of me, its steam curling into the air like an offering, and I suddenly felt trapped. The walls, which had once seemed quaint and nostalgic, now felt oppressive, closing in around me. I couldn't shake the sensation that the room had shifted, that I wasn't alone anymore. I stood up abruptly, knocking my chair back with a loud scrape. The woman didn't move, but her eyes followed me as I rushed for the door. I flung it open, and the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. As I stumbled out into the rain, I turned back to look at the cafe one last time. The sign, still flickering dimly, cast a strange glow over the building. That's when I saw it. The other cars, the ones I hadn't noticed before, were parked in the lot now. Old, rusted vehicles with broken headlights, all facing the cafe like they were waiting for something. I didn't know what was happening. The cold sweat on my skin made the rain feel even colder. My car, the only one in the parking lot when I arrived, now seemed out of place. I jumped in and slammed the door shut, my hands trembling as I started the engine. I glanced back one last time. The windows of the cafe were dark now. The light had gone out and the place looked abandoned, as though it had never been there at all. I drove away without looking back, my heart racing. The road stretched on endlessly in front of me, and as the rain poured down harder, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cafe and the woman who ran it would always be waiting for me, hidden somewhere between the miles, in that in-between place where time seemed to stand still. The next day, I tried to find the cafe again. I drove for hours, retracing my steps, but no matter where I looked, there was no sign of Gracie's roadside cafe. The highway was empty, the road stretching out like it always had. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was something else. But I know this, I'll never stop at a roadside cafe again. Story the end.